I wanted to follow up a little bit on my discussion with Jason D'Angelo about system diagrams. In that conversation, I alluded to other games like Carrie and Nine Worlds and Mars Colony, all of which are wonderful games, some of which are published and remembered and played, and some of which are not. So I wanted to give a little recognition to them as well. The first one I want to talk about is Carrie by Nathan Paletta, and it is set in the thick of the Vietnam War. From the point of view of American soldiers, it's heavily influenced by movies like Platoon and books like The Things They Carried. And the essence of this game concerns dice pools. There's dice scattered all over the table in big piles. And although each player has his or her own dice, we can think of them collectively as players' dice as a bunch, especially because they can give them to each other ad lib. But still, that does play a role sometimes. Anyway, the play is divided into two kinds, squad scenes and action scenes. And you can see in the diagram that the net effect is to bleed the dice away. Any action scene bleeds away player dice. And it also, the little asterisk there indicates something called fallout, which means that members of the squad are dying. The essence of play is, well, kind of brutally paced by the loss of all members of the squad, except for the player characters who are armored against death until the end. So it's guaranteed they're going to be the last people standing. The squad scenes, which are a little bit more soap opera-y, are a little bit more complex in that when players roll the dice in squad scenes, they may come back to you, or they may go over to the GM's dice pool. And also during squad scenes, the GM's dice are bleeding away as well. So basically, no matter what happens, with a little bit of cycling, the dice are going away. As this occurs, scene by scene by scene, or at least action scene by action scene, the squad is being whittled away through combat casualties, and that's sort of the basic idea at work here. But what's interesting is that you don't just play until the dice run out. The dice themselves are not pacing mechanisms for the course of play. That's Fallout that does that. Instead, there are some secondary mechanics that show you what all these changes are accomplishing. When a given player's dice run out, and also with several other kinds of results, they have a couple of options. One is to change their character profile, which can be thought of as a huge psychological shift in how that character is addressing being in this war theater. And another one is to resolve burdens. Burdens are problems, worries, concerns that the characters carry. Resolving burdens doesn't sound, it sounds nice, but it's not as good as it sounds. You're going to get a new one for one thing. The interesting point about resolving burdens is that they will refill dice pools, both for the player's dice and the GM's dice if that pool happens to be empty. And changing profile can do the same thing. Sometimes it's one die, sometimes it's a full refill of some kind. But the idea is that yes, people do get dice back from out of play after a few scenes and after a few dramatic shifts. This is kind of a sucking wind situation. You don't really have monstrous dice pools. And if you do get a big windfall from one of the mechanics, they're going to be whittled away pretty fast. So since inside the resolution, the die that you pick to use also has psychological ramifications, and you may only have certain dice that are available to you in your pool or what others are willing to give you. So there's some subroutines of resolution that play very strongly from exactly which dice are currently available to you. So as you can see, since play itself as a whole is paced by the loss of the squad until the player characters are the only people left, that what these dice mechanics do serve as psychological constraints, stress and psychological portraiture and constraints upon action. So that's what these mechanisms of the dice do as they get whittled down and as the replacement mechanisms become a lot more constraining and a lot more crucial in any particular later scene. By the time you get to the end, the characters are, run ragged and are through various psychological shifts and options, or they are they've worked through various problems and yet have acquired others, and by that point there's a whole lot of blood under the bridge among them as well, due to the interactions of their profiles at any given time, and you may well end up with a very bloody epilogue among them as well. So anyway, that's a quick look at Carrie and the mechanisms of its dice and what they're for. Now, Nine Worlds by Matt Snyder happens to be one of the games I value above many, if not most others, due to its sophistication, due to the remarkable integration of the imagined material with the mechanics. Carrie and Nine Worlds came out of a period of game design in which that was really a shining light in that community of designers. And Nine Worlds is a bit more complex mechanically, and we'll actually have to walk you through 3 diagrams and several different approaches toward play at the time. So let's take a look. Well, what are we talking about? First of all, we're talking about what I like to think of as a sort of Jack Kirby cosmic, futuristic interpretation of Greek mythology. So the 9 worlds really are the solar system, with the moon and the sun and stuff counting as worlds. And there are ether ships that fly among them, and it is sort of a just after canonical Greek mythology and a number of soap opera events that have occurred since then. And it's pretty freaky, really, and quite a lot of fun. When we played it, we yanked down all these books on Greek mythology that go a little deeper than the standard presentation of the myths, and figured out how all the different characters are related to each other, and discovered things like, Medusa has all these kids and all sorts of things like that. Well, as it turns out, we found several layers to the system. The system is based on ordinary playing cards, and without going into great detail, you play some cards and compare them to the others in terms of totals of given suits and stuff like that. Well, taking a look at the diagram, we are thinking very specifically in terms of resolution. You're looking at your hand size. You begin by choosing arete or hubris as your primary attribute, and you also do something called choosing an urge, which really isn't all that important for this explanation. That sets your basic hand size, then that's modified by the muse or muses that are involved. Muses are statements of motivation, very non-abstract, very goal-oriented. And so if your muses are in play in this particular resolution, then you're getting more cards. You can have up to 9 muses, and each one can be rated up to 9 points, and I don't think I've ever seen the maximum. That's kind of crazy, but you have a lot. So straightforwardly, if you're leading with an urge and you are hitting with muses, your motivations, and so you've got your hand size, and let's say you get this great hand size. If you win, you get these points. And so the points can do a few things. First of all, winning in and of itself means you win that immediate conflict, period. Doesn't matter about the points. But the points are very, very handy for a couple of reasons. For one thing, you can create permanent effects, and that depends on some details. So with these points, you can take, and you're victorious, and you can take your points and you can create permanent effects based on the urge that you chose. And this is actually pretty handy because in this game, say, one of the spawn of Cerberus comes after you and you slay it. You won the card draw, and that's fantastic. Slew it. Well, this is Greek mythology, and the freaking thing is going to come after you in some form anyway, or could later on, unless you spend some points to lock it down. and say, okay, that's done with you for sure. So therefore, points create very permanent effects in lots of things which in other role-playing games would be permanent already through the victory, which here they're not. Anyway, so you've got the points can do that. They can also be spent straight into your muses and make your muses more powerful, and that's your improvement mechanism at this level. So you do things that you're motivated by, and you can spend points to become very effective in your conflicts, and you can also spend the points to make your muses bigger and to add new muses when you get new motivations and stuff like that. So this is kind of a nice little basic cycle of function. But that's not all. Here, we can use muses in a fashion that uses them up. In the previous diagram, all they did was get bigger, and I told you there was a maximum. Here, you can actually use them as currency of their own. And the first thing you can do is if you win a conflict and you would like to have more points than the conflict results gave you, you can spend down muses to do it. And that's permanent. You're actually lowering the muses, but you're really delving into your character's primary goals and motivations to say this right here is extremely important to me to make this effect permanent. So that's one thing. So that's a bit of a backspin into the same system that I already described so that the muses can be a little bit of extra currency for effectiveness. They can also do other things. If you don't want your character to die and your character is in the moment about to die, you can just wax a muse, and that's a permanent loss of that muse, and you can't rewrite it later, and you've basically lost a part of yourself, but your character doesn't die. And another thing it can do, if a muse hits its maximum level of 9, you resolve that muse, and you have a choice. You can either take your character out of play and say, you know what, that was the main thing that this character really wanted to accomplish, and I am okay with this character no longer being a protagonist in play, and just that story's over. Or you can get this new set of currency called either valor or pride. And the thing about valor or pride is once you have them, they can be spent into conflicts affecting not hand size directly, but to actually call one of the suits at trump status. And at that point, you can basically steamroll other people that you're in conflict with, even if your standard resolution is nowhere near enough to beat them. It's sort of the Uber system of resolution, but you have to have valor or pride to do it. So as you can see, the muses now are serving as currency of their own at these somewhat larger scales of play, more permanent effectiveness, life or death, retiring or not, building these kind of superhuman, super metaphysical attributes. So that's the second level of understanding this particular system. But that's not all. We also have yet another layer of what can be done once you have racked up valor and pride. And so now that you have Trump mechanics available to you, we're kind of done with resolution in terms of messing with it. Everything I talked about, that's resolution from now on, and we're fine. But now you're looking at your valor and your pride, and what else can you do with these things? You can use pride to make a talisman, which, roughly speaking, is sort of a sidekicky or persona or character of its own that you also control, a magic item, effectively. And so you've made this talisman. You can do that. You can also use valor to increase your primary attributes of arete or hubris. So that's what they're good enough for. Now, so what? Well, these are kind of interesting because at heavy levels of arete and hubris, you're ready to challenge a god if you want to. Now, challenging a god can mean a couple of things. One is that you are challenging the god in terms of wanting to be their greatest champion. That's one thing you could do, is sort of consider the more or less conformist or more or less buy into the power structure of this setting. Or you can challenge God much more literally, in which case it's more hubris-based and you are, supplanting a god. So this is, if you will, the highest level of play, the where you are stomping around in the world of literally creating things into the metaphysics and physics of play. You are taking your place in the power structure and passing your judgments on where you want your character to stand among the most powerful entities in the 9 worlds. It may seem as though this is really complicated, but the learning curve is surprisingly shallow. You really only have to understand the initial resolution mechanics, the urges and the points and the muses, that first diagram. You get that down, and the rest just flows as consequences of play when you realize, oh, well, I have these, what happens when they get a little bigger? And then you just answer that question. And once you get it, you're looking at it saying, wow, okay, this is pretty powerful. Note there's some really remarkable flexibility in terms of what you want to happen to your character when you get to the point where you're able to say, well, do I want my character to live or die? Do I want my character to be done with their story? Do I want my character to be a mover and a shaker? And if so, what kind? And at that highest level, things are more flexible than they look. I won't go into all the details, but suffice to say that you might imagine that if you are a very loyal, very faithful, very obedient, for example, ward of a god or something like that, well, you would build up valor, build up valor, build up valor, build up arete, build up arete, build up arete, and then become a champion. Well, you could, and conversely, perhaps instead you would build up pride and make talismans and build up your hubris, perhaps, through whatever valor you did accumulate, and then it would seem logical that you would go into challenge rather than being a champion. But the system doesn't lock you down quite so much. The capability of a sudden dramatic decision to swing one way or the other in that regard is quite real, and the point structure doesn't prevent you from doing it. So there's an unpredictability to the drama, which is quite engaging with all of this power available to you after first you've been racking up points, and second you've been racking up muses, and then third you've been racking up valor and or pride. And finally we come to Mars Colony by Tim Kopeng. And Mars Colony is a 2-player game and concerns the travails of a Martian colony while it is still subject to the Earth government, and it is in travail, it's in crisis. And so there is a charismatic and well-known, widely respected person whose name is Kelly Perkins, who is sent to Mars by the Earth government basically to fix things and to create a more healthy colony economically, ecologically, who knows how, socially, and also kind of restore faith in the general structure and arrangement of the establishment of the Earth government and the power structure as it exists. Well, easy enough. Play proceeds through different kinds of scenes. I'm going to focus on what are called progress scenes, to which play is limited to 9. And so once you do 9 progress scenes, the game is over. But we are going to progress through a progress scene, and sooner or later you're going to be making a roll, and let's do it fairly, let's say everything's great. What that roll will give you is health points for a given problem of the colony that you're trying to address in the moment. And so that's great. You got health points, and if you accumulate 20 points for that particular problem, then you're going to help stabilize it. And if you get 40, then you get admiration. So you've got all this admiration. So that would be great. I mean, what if we do 9 scenes of this? Fantastic. Savior of the colony. You have made the grade. You have, Earth government's safe, Mars colony government knows its place, and the people are happy, healthy, and fed, and not restive. And you end up with this wonderful story. Suffice to say, the mechanics are by no means that forgiving. And it's very easy, especially once you start getting a little bit aggressive about trying to build up those health points, well, to run into some failures. Now, One form of failure is truly disastrous and results not only in building up contempt, which is what happens when you roll a failure and you are stuck with it. If you roll very badly, then you will also be humiliated and you will truly be stuck with eating that contempt. But let's say that doesn't happen. What are your options? Your options then is to lie. Your option then is to say, well, you know what? I'm going to tell the people that we fixed it or are about to fix it or whatever, and we're kind of not. Well, guess what? That counts. Now, so instead of just health, you now have health plus lies, and that counts for the total. That counts for that 40-point thing that could get you admiration. There are some tricky issues that come with racking up your admiration through lies as well as genuine achievements. For one thing, instead of admiration, or rather you have to take admiration and move it into deception, and several issues can occur with that as well. Once you get deceptions going, you're building up bank of deception, then the chance for a scandal and the loss of all your lie points and everything can occur. So effectively speaking, it is possible to finish out the 9 progress scenes with primarily admiration. Doing it without ever having to lie is, if statistically possible, is practically impossible. And then once you have started to lie, the question is how much are you going to push it? And on the other hand, basically there may be things that you choose not to lie about, and you're just going to have to accept limited success. You're just maybe not going to build up a whole lot of material gain or a whole lot of admiration through the course of play. So exactly how it turns out it's not like a score. You don't say, okay, I won or I lost, but you do know how well you served the colony, and you do know how much you had to lie to do it, and you do know when that backfired on you and how. And so it's kind of up to you to decide where the character stands relative to their own self-image and relative to the political structure and everything like that, looking at what occurred. So in sum, I didn't talk much about resolution in Carrie, this nitty-gritty of, okay, here is the ambush and what are your characters doing, and here, the radio is not working, what do you do, and the stress of looking at the available dice that you have in front of you and realizing that there are things you cannot do, that your character is psychologically blocked from doing at the moment. Instead, I looked at the more overall flow of dice and showed how their whittling down facilitates creating those circumstances and then also those dramatic shifts in the character's portrait and their state of mind. So then in 9 Worlds, we have much more of sort of an uber look based on resolution in and of itself, and what you might think of as slightly more standard reward mechanics. You're actually building up reward points and deciding how to spend them in different ways at different times. And then in Mars Colony, the points are a little bit less about what's inside your character's head or what they're capable of effectively doing this minute in terms of, I have this much punch available to me. Instead, they're much more about the way other characters are looking at this primary character. They're much more about the interplay of slightly abstract ethical considerations, as well as the colony in and of itself as a real entity. If you really look at it, that's the only really real thing in play, is just how well the colony is doing for each one of its currently critical problems and how well Kelly has done in addressing it for real. So 3 different ways to interact with points, with randomizing factors, and with what are very generally called reward mechanics, all of which are tuned through play, all of which are intimately tied to what is imagined, where setting and situation, characterization are all extremely, extremely interactive with the setting's own specific features playing into it for the people at the table to seize upon and make into shapes of their own. Understanding role-playing games through these system diagrams isn't intended to be a full summary of their mechanics. It's not really a teaching device. It's not like, well, okay, I'm going to teach you how to play. This is much more in the sense of once we have learned how to play, then we step back and can look at it and say, what are the dynamics at work here that make this thing playable and turn into processes of fun and satisfaction and communication and interaction? How do they work in that regard that makes them very different from any board game or card game or any kind of screen-based MMORPG or digital console game of any kind, and very different from anything regarding, well, let's just all agree upon it and move along kind of consensual storytelling. This is something new. This is something special. This is something understandable. And the degree to which you make your own system more or less complex in this regard is a tremendously wide open, tremendously personal thing. All of these games are full of not just subroutines, like for example resolution and carry, but also full of soft techniques, things that are very optional in the moment. I mentioned giving dice to one another in carry. They're also full of things where the color of what's going on and the precise imagined situation of what's happening plays into things very, very strongly in fashions that simply imbue all of play. And therefore, these diagrams are a lot like a skeleton, and they cannot be thought of as, the essential game or the real game or anything like that inside it. They should be, however, considered and understood as necessary and valuable for what this particular game is capable of doing, and why this, that, other systems of given role-playing games are not interchangeable, and that the idea of compatibility and the idea of interchangeability and skinning this or that idea for this or that system is not really an accurate understanding of the available range of role-playing games at all.